Good morning. Thank you, everyone. I'm David Beam. I'm a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Mayor Brown, and I'm going to be following up on Bob's presentation as well as some earlier presentations this morning and talking about the issues of privacy and cybersecurity, specifically as it relates to the new technology of distributed ledgers and blockchains. Now, who here at your company explored the use of any kind of distributed ledger or blockchain technology in terms of your business? Is this something that a lot of you are looking at? I'll take it for a show of hands. This has not come up as a big issue yet. Okay. Well, hopefully I anticipate actually it will. I think there's a lot of interest in this area, and there's a lot of talk. Right now, it's really the financial services industry that is most focused on the applications of distributed ledgers, but there's a lot of potential uses beyond that. And even if it's not something that you plan to use to provide a service directly to your customers, as in you are, an active participant in a distributed ledger, it is something that I think that, in 10 years, almost every company represented in this room is going to have some kind of significant distributed ledger involvement, or something that qualifies as a distributed ledger. Now, what do I mean by distributed ledger? Well, I'm going to go through kind of the blockchain basics for lawyers. This is kind of a non-technical explanation. But basically, a distributed ledger, the definition I got from Investopedia, is a database that is consensually shared and synchronized across a network spread across multiple sites, institutions, or geographies. Basically, what this means is that normally when you have a ledger that shows the rights and responsibilities or ownership or transactions between various counterparties, and the ledger records everything, traditionally we have a centralized person who maintains that ledger. The classic example is a real estate recording office. Who owns that piece of property? Well, the real estate recording office just keeps track of that. If person A sells a piece of property to person B, they go to the recording office and they file with the recording office a notice of that. Then you can go look on the ledger and it shows who owns what and who has done what transactions. The idea with the distributed ledger is somehow that this is spread out. It's spread out among a large number of different people who all have a copy of the ledger. And there's some various types of technological mechanisms, there's different approaches that have been taken to ensure that only people can make changes to the ledger only that they are authorized to make, so that you can't, for example, change someone else's property interest. Bitcoin was the first real, perhaps not the first, but really the biggest, newest, most widely distributed ledger implementation that we've seen, where you have the ledger keeps track of how many Bitcoins all these people in the world own. And through various cryptographic mechanisms, you're able to ensure that a person who makes a change on the ledger, which is going to be reflected on what are called nodes all throughout the world, is a person authorized to do that I can't go and take another person's Bitcoin here and give that Bitcoin to someone else. And they use very complex cryptography to accomplish that, and it's based on NSA encryption. But basically the idea there is that it's distributed. Now, not all distributed ledgers use what's called blockchain technologies. You've probably heard the term blockchain before. It's actually the more popular term, and it's popular both because it sounds better than distributed ledger, so the media likes it, but also because it is the most common type of technology used for a distributed ledger. They're oftentimes used interchangeably. Now, if you get technical, though, there is a difference. This blockchain is a building block that is one building block that's used for distributed ledgers. As of now, that's its primary application. It does have some potential other applications, but a blockchain is a software protocol which validates and records transactions on the distributed ledger. Basically, it's called the blockchain because it has to do with the underlying construct of how the records, the data on the ledger are held. They're held in bits of data called blocks, and there's literally a chain of blocks that you can use to track a transaction. And so when you hear the term blockchain, it's usually talking about that kind of underlying technology. And here it mentions some of the different ways in which you'll hear the term blockchain. It's a term that's not always precisely used. Sometimes again, the correct definition is that it's actually the technology used to operate distributed ledger. But you'll commonly hear people refer to a distributed ledger as a blockchain. And that's a common, it's arguably an imprecise use. And then also it's sometimes used generically to refer to just distributed ledgers generally. It's used as similar to the way people use the word cloud when they're talking about computing. You know, this is, where is it? What's in the cloud? Well, of course, it's somewhere. It's on a server. You know, I saw a great thing. It said that, you know, it's not on the cloud. It's on someone else's computer. And that's exactly the same thing here, is that, you know, people refer to this as kind of a general concept, but there's actually not just one blockchain, but a series of different blockchains. Again, the most famous use of blockchain is for Bitcoin, which I'm sure everyone here has heard of Bitcoin. Does anyone own a Bitcoin? You own a Bitcoin, Julian? Yep, and he's actually the one. He had the sign with the cloud joke I just said, no one else. No one else. Usually we get a couple. Okay. Okay. So, well, Bitcoin basically, I'm sure everyone's heard of it though, right? A Bitcoin. Okay. You know what it is, and it's a non-government-backed digital currency. It is recorded on the blockchain. There's this big distributed ledger out there, maintained by a variety of different entire community of users, and on this ledger is a record of every Bitcoin that every person owns. The people are identified by what are called public keys, which is a pseudonym. But you can tell every Bitcoin they own. You can actually look back on this, and anyone in the public can go and see every transaction since the inception of Bitcoin. Sure, I think it was like in 2010, early 2010 was the first transaction. Every transaction that has ever occurred with Bitcoin by going back through the distributed ledger. And the idea is that Bitcoin doesn't exist outside of that distributed ledger. That is, that people recognize it, and it has value because people will accept that my transfer to you of value on this distributed ledger is something that I will give you real-world goods and services for, because I'm going to accept that as payment because I consider it to have value. But it doesn't give you any rights beyond that outside of what's on the ledger itself. That's different from most of the applications that people are talking about beyond Bitcoin. And when you hear people talk about distributed ledgers, they want to use it to keep track of people's rights, but they're talking about the rights in the real world. They're talking about things like ownership of securities, where the idea is that if the ledger, this distributed ledger, reflects that I own a security, I have all the real-world rights that come with ownership of that security. And the reason that distinction is important, at least important to the lawyers, is that the ledger itself cannot be self-executing the way it is with Bitcoin. Bitcoin, ownership, transfer, all those rules governing Bitcoin are built into the protocols, into the inner workings of the ledger. They can't be altered by agreement. At least not the way it works can. But when you're talking about a security, if I'm going to demand that I receive a dividend from the company, and I'm going to demand that the company pay that to me, the company has to recognize I'm the legal owner of the security, which means that if my basis is that this distributed ledger says that I'm the owner of the security, there has to be some kind of legally enforceable mechanism outside of the ledger that gives me that right. And I think that a lot of that's going to be a big thing that we are going to focus on, as lawyers are going to focus on in the future, is how do you create that contractual infrastructure? It's also going to become, an important part of what I'm going to talk about later is how do the parties create that contractual infrastructure? Because you've got two types of distributed ledgers, really, or not two types, but one common division has to do with who can access the ledger. And is this an open system where anybody can come in and participate in transactions of the ledger as long as they have the sufficient technological know-how and can follow the requirements? Or is this something where it's a closed system where only a limited group of people have either access to view the ledger, to make changes on the ledger, or to participate in transactions that will be reflected on the ledger? And one of the reasons that's important from a lawyer's perspective is how you make people contractually obligated with respect to the transactions on the ledger is going to be very different under those two situations. Much, much easier to do when you have some kind of consortium arrangement where it's a closed group of people who get together and say, we want to all participate in this ledger, or where you have to get, there's some kind of entry, you have to join the club, if you will, in order to be a participant there. Then you can have that person execute some kind of network or system terms that say that they're going to recognize the enforceability of transactions of the ledger. I'm still trying to figure out, and a lot of other people are trying to figure out as well, how exactly you would do that, how you would create legally enforceable terms of service that would be enforceable all around the world, because by its very nature this is international. How you're going to do that, how you're going to make sure that everyone who participates in the ledger is bound by it. And when you get beyond a blockchain, where you're dealing with real world rights reflected on a ledger, that I think is going to be the biggest barrier. And then I have a bunch of slides here. I pulled these from actually these colleagues of mine who have done presentations. I use their slides, and I think that these are among the best I've seen. It's a hard thing in many ways to reflect visually. It's easy to reflect visually how a traditional centralized ledger works. You have a payment order. You have Bank A, and customer of Bank A wants to send $10 to a customer of Bank B. Well, this means, Bank A is going to update its customer records, and Bank B is going to update its customer records. But what has to happen is somehow that money that Bank A has to get from Bank A to Bank B. And the central bank serves that purpose. It maintains a centralized ledger. And so this is, visually very easy to see. Central bank, reflects $10 debit from Bank A's account with the central bank, and a $10 credit to Bank B's account. And Bank A and Bank B also make corresponding entries to their own customer accounts. And so it's very easy to see how this works. And the idea is, with a distributed ledger, like a Bitcoin transaction, is you cut out that central party, that you basically make the transaction on the ledger itself, which is distributed. And this is where it's hard to visually represent the absence of something. I think that's the basic problem. But the idea is you're still sending the instruction, but the instruction is going to, the instruction is actually the transfer on the chain. And in some ways I've been thinking about this is that we think about it as disintermediating because we don't have a single centralized authority, but of course you do still have somebody who's intermediating in the sense that there is still a ledger that's independent of user A and user B. It's just maintained by a large community. And so this instruction here, what actually happens here is this instruction gets dispersed to a whole bunch of different nodes. These are all people who maintain copies of a ledger. And there's a protocol in place whereby it's going to validate that person A actually owns that Bitcoin, that this person didn't, earlier in the day, go spend that Bitcoin with user C and give one Bitcoin to user C, and now it's going to, try to pull a fast one on user B and give that Bitcoin to user B. And the idea is that they can verify by going out to the nodes that user A actually does own the Bitcoin, hasn't already spent it. And then once that's validated, the transaction can go through, and an update to the ledger showing that user B owns the Bitcoin now will be reflected through a Ripple system. Basically, I'm going to kind of go through these slides quickly. Because they get into some of the more technical points of how this works at each step in the process. But of course, the idea is conceptually, you've gotten rid of the central bank. You have replaced it with a distributed ledger rather than a central ledger, so there is still a ledger involved that's independent of the two parties to the transaction, but you've got that. You've got that here. Now, I think that actually distributed ledger, Bitcoin, we always start with Bitcoin, and I'm still in the habit of starting with Bitcoin because it's the first, it's one everyone's heard of. But I actually think Bitcoin is in many ways much more complicated conceptually than most kind of distributed ledger applications that a lot of people in the business world are thinking of, because I think it's a little easier, it's a little harder to get your head around this vast community of users where anyone can kind of participate who has the technological know-how, both as a node and as a participant in the system, and understand how that entire system can function and work under open source protocol. But it's a little, I think, easier to understand when you're just thinking about a narrower group of people who get together and agree on a protocol that they're going to use to maintain a ledger of transactions among them, and that they're going to set up a system whereby that updates to the ledger can occur without going through the central party. Now, one of the questions you probably are asking is, why would you do this? And sometimes people who have proposals for distributed ledger don't have a good answer to that question, actually. I mean, sometimes I've talked to people who they have this great new idea for a distributed ledger technology that they're going to operate and deploy. It's going to replace all kinds of centralized ledgers in some specific industry segment, and you get to the question and say, what is the advantage here? And you realize it's like, well, it's cool that we can do it. I mean, it's sometimes what it boils down to. And they don't necessarily have a good answer. And that doesn't mean that it's always, never serves an additional purpose. But one way in which it can be very useful is if properly structured, it can result in real-time information for all the people in a way that just isn't always technologically possible with a centralized ledger, that all the participants can know at the same time when a transaction occurs. It also generally, the expectation is that these can be implemented in a way that's going to substantially reduce clearing and settlement costs for certain types of transactions, so just a real practical dollars and cents advantage. And in addition to just the very specific costs with transaction level costs, this is probably something that all the parties can do with substantially less overhead. Not only do you not have the overhead associated with maintaining the central ledger, because oftentimes what happens is that there's duplication in terms of resources, so you can get rid of that out of the system, but you also, in the parties themselves, by distributing this, you eliminate a lot of duplication that you'd find among the different parties. So those are the big reasons, the good reasons that you'd see somebody look at this as an advantage. Now, another reason, this is something that gets into the cybersecurity realm, which is that the argument is that you'll hear people say distributed ledger is unhackable. I always say don't go say unhackable to a regulator, because that just calls to mind the historical metaphor for hubris, the Titanic, the unsinkable Titanic. Everybody knows nothing's unhackable. I mean, I think that that's a fair statement. And the explanation you always get if you ask why it's unhackable is it'll explain why. Using present hacking techniques that would work for a centralized ledger, why you couldn't apply those to a distributed ledger. Now, that's true, but that's very different from saying it's completely unhackable. I think that probably, most regulators are not going to be eager to hear you get too overconfident about its inability to hack. But one argument is that it is much more difficult to hack, and part of the reason is because the ledger isn't in one place. And that is, I think, when you get into legal requirements, an important, that's an important distinction between, saying it's unhackable because it's in one place. When you're talking about cybersecurity, there's really two things that we're thinking about, two things we're trying to prevent. One, we're trying to prevent unauthorized alteration, corruption, deletion, etc. of critical records. We don't want people to come in and change, delete anything they're not supposed to. Now, the second thing is we're trying to prevent people from just getting access to records they're not supposed to be looking at. And when DLT promoters say, oh, it's much better from a cybersecurity perspective, it's unhackable, what they mean is it's harder to make a permanent, indelible change, unauthorized change in the ledger. Because even if you could hack in to one node, you just get that node, and there's systems in place to prevent that from infecting the entire system. But that doesn't address the second prong, which is that, that cybersecurity, which is prevent people from seeing something they're not supposed to see. And distributed ledgers aren't necessarily better for that, precisely because there's multiple copies of the ledger, and that there's potentially more access points if you have multiple nodes working with the ledger. And if they're supposed to read the CLE code, I assume, yeah, I guess so. So if you're applying for CLE credit via webinar, please include the code below on the attorney affirmation form. Embedded code 08FF19. Okay. So here's where we get into the cybersecurity considerations. Again, as I was just saying, the two advantages: preventing unauthorized alteration, deletion, et cetera, but then also preventing unauthorized access. And when you get into the regulatory realm, that's the second part where there's a lot of issues here. And we've heard a lot today about privacy laws. Rebecca Eisner talked about some this morning, and one of the things actually I thought was really interesting that she said, I guess there's in Europe, I think I got this right, one of the countries implemented a EU directive with a requirement that certain data stay in the country. I think I got that right. But in any event, but basically that kind of restriction. Now that used to be, that used to be a very common restriction. I remember when e-sign first came out, and suddenly regulators had to accept the fact that companies could maintain their crucial business records digitally, that a regulator couldn't say, no, we want you to keep paper records. It was very frustrating to many of them. But one of the things that kind of, I guess, the loophole, if you will, in many state record-keeping laws, particularly at the state level, record-keeping laws was that it said, that you had the record location had to be in the state. Or in a particular location or at the headquarters. So the e-sign said the regulators couldn't stop you from digitizing your records, but you really were limited in your ability to do that by this kind of geographic limitation that didn't always work with what we would now call the cloud. At the time we didn't call it the cloud, but it was a basic concept of it's somewhere, it's just not here. And that's another concern. I didn't realize there were still, it's kind of gone in the United States. I don't think there are a lot, at least in the financial realm. That's just the area I know. There might be other areas where there's still kind of requirements. They pretty much nextized the U.S. law. It's interesting to hear that Europe, at least, someplace has a very similar requirement. And those type of requirements are going to be issues for the blockchain. If you're going to use the distributed ledger as your record for your record-keeping purposes, because one of the things you need to look at is, can I even put this information on the ledger? If the information is subject to a privacy law like HIPAA, GLBA, or the other thing that is often overlooked, it might be subject to confidentiality restrictions on some contract that you have, which impose similar restrictions. Those records might even prohibit you from putting it onto the blockchain, because that just simply might be considered sharing it with people who aren't allowed to see it. GLBA, for example, is very specific about with whom a financial institution can share confidential consumer information. And also, Bob was talking about the data breach laws. I think there's a lot of interesting issues there. When you have somebody who has responsibility with respect to a data under a data breach law, and this goes out onto a distributed ledger, how do you ensure that, first of all, who's going to be responsible if there's a hack against a node that holds the distributed ledger? Is it going to be the party that, quote unquote, owned the data, that put the data onto the ledger in the first place? Or is it going to be the node? Is it going to be both of them? That's going to have to be determined. And then you're going to have some mechanism to ensure that every node is going to notify every appropriate person if they ever have a hack. Because otherwise, if that person does have a data breach notification, then they have to be notified that there's been a hack through the node. And that goes back to something that would have to be imposed by a contractual relationship through the system. So even if you can determine that you can, put it in basically, you have to be concerned about that. One of the most interesting things here, I think, and I'm not going to get into it today, but certainly for financial institutions who have extensive rules governing diligence, vetting, supervision, oversight, management of service providers, companies that provide their service. I'm still trying to figure out how you would classify all the different participants in a digital ledger that you use as a financial institution in various ways. Which one of them would qualify as a service provider under these different service provider guidelines? And if they do qualify, and sometimes I think that under the broad spectrum of these banking agency guidance they would, how you do the required diligence, monitoring, and oversight of them. Again, it's something that's going to have to be baked into the system rules. So the final thought is on record retention. I think that there's a lot of also, if you're going to use the digital ledger to comply with record retention requirements, rules that you maintain certain records, provide access to them, there's a lot of questions you need to ask before you do that. And this range from questions such as, can I make a duplicate copy of the ledger to satisfy my record-keeping obligation? Obviously, it will be an official copy, but this way I have records in my control. Well, that's not always allowed by the system rules. And others in the system might not want records to be kept. And so then you're going to have to make sure that your regulators are comfortable with you relying on this community to maintain records that are considered crucial business records. And there's a variety of questions you need to ask. How well is it going to hold historical data? How do you ensure that it does hold and always will hold the crucial data points that you're required to maintain? These are, I think, the questions you need to ask. And here goes, this is actually back to the cloud point. Sometimes you have to identify. You're allowed to keep it outside the state now, but you still have to identify where the records are. And that's going to be an interesting question to answer if your records are on the blockchain, because again, the cloud isn't a location. And actually, I've been dealing with this recently with it's a long story, but basically trying to get IT people to tell us where certain records are stored just because there's a notice requirement to regulators. And they keep coming back, no, it's in the cloud. It's in the cloud. We can't tell you where it is. It's in the cloud. It's like, no. It's on a server somewhere. That server has a terrestrial location, and I need to know where that is. But apparently, this is, technology has advanced to the point where we just don't even know where our records are, and this is considered an accomplishment. But the blockchain, the regulators don't accept it, and this is neither is the blockchain. The blockchain is you're going to have to be more precise about where the records are held. Again, sometimes the solution is just a backup. So I think that's about it. Is there any questions? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so you asked, did anyone have Bitcoin in the room? Yeah. I raised my hand. It was about 25 cents worth of Bitcoin that I received, I don't know, enough years back that by now it's probably worth all of $20, which I'd love to take out and spend on lunch sometime. But I forgot the password to my digital wallet.
Oh, yeah.
And there's no, unlike with the cloud, there's no sort of trusted centralized authority for me to go say, forgot my password, can you please help me out? It's gone. Now, I guess my question is, is this kind of a serious problem with blockchain technology, this, the hard cutoff of security, or is this more just like an artifact of the particular kind of wallet I'm using? We could sort of get around this with having, third-party gateways to the blockchain that would overcome this. I mean, is this a serious bug? And if it is it fixable, or is it a feature, on some level too? Is it part of what makes the security so interesting?
Well, I definitely think that, the promoters of blockchain would say that it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's an inherent feature of the system is that you absolutely cannot, you cannot recover the private key you need. And it's also a security feature because it means nobody else can go through whatever steps you would take to recover it. Nobody else can do that fraudulently and then get your private key. And that's important to the Bitcoin system because all transactions are irreversible. So if someone were to get your private key and spend that $20 on something else, at that point there's no mechanism for you to get it back. So they would say that this is an important feature, that you don't have any kind of recovery mechanism. I don't know. I don't know if I mean, certainly the way Bitcoin is designed, I think it's so inherent to the system, but I'm actually not sure if you could just still use the same technology but design it differently in a way that would have some kind of password recovery. But again, you would have that problem that if somebody does have the authentication credentials, these systems don't make it easy to reverse transactions. Usually they're designed that way. Yeah, I'll tell you, I've probably heard the story, or do I just? I'll tell you the story. There's actually a guy who got investors to excavate the town dump to recover his computer, on which there was this is in Britain, 15 million pounds worth of Bitcoin. He had been an early, player in Bitcoin when it was, just starting, and he had a whole bunch of private keys sitting on his computer that he then dropped, and then later Bitcoin became cool, it skyrocketed value, literally the value went up that much. And so he had to, I don't know if he ever found it, but he actually had to go find that because there's no other way to get the Bitcoins. So it could be worse in 20. So
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.